Refreshing wild cherry cola meets smooth cream. The treat you deserve. Pepsi Wild Cherry and Cream. Treat yourself.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. Stop waiting around for the perfect candidate. Instead, use Indeed sponsored jobs to find the right people with the right skills fast. It's a simple way to make sure your listing is the first candidates see. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs have 4 times more applicants than non-sponsored jobs. So go build your dream team today with Indeed. Get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
Three, two, one. Welcome to another BritFlix.com podcast. My name is Stuart Wright, and today's guest is filmmaker Jeremiah Kipp. Welcome to the show.
Stuart, I'm so happy to be here.
We are here to discuss your new movie, Mortuary Assistant, which is out on Shudder from the 27th of March, 2026. Is that right?
That is correct, yeah.
Superb. Congratulations. So, before we get into any details about that, we will also, of course, be discussing 3 films that have impacted everything in your adult life when we've done a conversation about your new movie. Are you ready for that part of the show?
Oh, indeed. I'm prepped.
Good man. Good man. So, before we get into any details about Mortuary Assistant, do you want to give a brief synopsis as to what Mortuary Assistant is about?
Yes, a young mortician named Rebecca Owens has just started her term at Riverfield's Mortuary. And after completing her interview, she is unexpectedly called in for the night shift. And when she does, at first everything seems normal, or as normal as anything can be when you're working among the dead.
Mm-hmm.
But then strange things start to happen out of the corner of her eye. And she and the audience come to realize that there's more to this place than she imagined. And the supernatural forces at work within this mortuary start inflicting themselves upon Rebecca. And the question soon becomes, will she survive the night?
Indeed, indeed. So usually at this point, I will ask people, what was the kernel of the idea that led to developing the film X or Y? But your film is an adaptation of a 2002 video game from Darkstone Digital of the same name. So what attracted you to this game as one that had potential to be a movie? Or how did you get involved with the adapting of this video game to be a movie?
I was approached by Epic Pictures Group, who was the sales agent of my previous feature, Slapface, which is also on Shudder.
Yeah.
They owned the rights to the video game, which was created by Darkstone Digital, which is in the person of Brian Clark. He's a solo game developer.
Okay.
It wasn't my wildest dream to adapt a video game into a movie. There's a long storied history of video game adaptations that make people very unhappy. People who love the games, Mario Brothers and Doom, really hate those movies, I knew I was walking into territory where there's a known video game curse attached to it. But, when I played the game, I soon realized that I loved it. I loved that it had a very compelling narrative with very interesting characters. Rebecca Owens, Raymond Delver, the monsters within the space were incredibly interesting to me. But even more than that, even more than just it being a spooky story in an interesting liminal space, I really responded to the character of Rebecca Owens. She's very good at living in her work and not very good at living in her life. This reminded me a lot of myself when I was in my mid-20s, where I strongly preferred being on movie sets to dealing with any of the complexities of my human relationships or the complexities of just being a human being. It's much easier to deal within a narrow frame, such as like embalming a corpse or doing a 12-hour day on a movie set, than dealing with the harshness of our living reality. And that's what I responded to in Rebecca. And that was the theme that I pinned the whole movie on. I said, like, okay, that's who I respond to. That's what I care about. And indeed, the themes of resilience and survival and in The Mortuary Assistant seems to be something that I like when I go to the movies as well. And the movies that we're going to talk about later. It's, you could draw a through line from one film to another, even though there may seem to be no resemblance between Killer of Sheep and Jennifer's Body. If you look at them all as stories of resilience and survival within social hierarchies, you can see that that's what I'm interested in. And Mortuary Assistant, indeed, the horror stuff is pleasing to me, but the human stuff is really what plugged me into the project. We want to adapt the game into a movie.
I've not had the pleasure of adapting video games to screen, but I have adapted a couple of books, and when I did that, there was obviously that tension between the person, the original author, and me, the person taking it to screen. And I had two very different. I've only done two, but there were two very different conversations.
Yeah, I'll bet, because everybody is so.
Yeah, and my producer at the time gave me a really good sort of question to ask. When, as an icebreaker, he said, just ask them, what's the worst thing I can do adapting your book to screen? And
that's a great question.
And it was I didn't realize what it would open, but it was actually really useful because it kind of revealed straight away, on the one hand, this book has to not be, I don't want you to dilute the message of the book. So that was an easy one to sort of deal with. And the other one was, you can do what you want. Just see my book as a jumping off point, which obviously is scary, but also exciting. So I see that Brian Clark, as the designer of the game, is credited on IMDb as a written by on the film.
That's right.
And so how much direct involvement did he have working alongside Tracy Beebe in terms of the screenwriting, or what was the conversations like with Brian about developing the game to a film?
Well, Brian was with me from the beginning.
Okay.
And he's still with me now. Tomorrow we're doing an interview together to promote the film.
Okay.
So when I came on board, Brian was the first person that I spoke with when interviewing about the project.
Yeah.
They were interviewing a lot of different directors. And I think that Brian responded to my take on the material, and he felt like I was plugged into the same things that he was interested in when he created the game.
Right.
So I made sure that he was included in the process throughout. I was on board as a director before we had a script, and he wasn't initially the screenwriter. Tracy Beebe was brought on, because she had also a very clear through line for the character of Rebecca Owens, which is something that Brian responded to.
Yeah,
and it wasn't until much later in the process, when we were in pre-production, and indeed on set, that Brian was molding the script to bring it closer to the weirdness and the things that intrigued me about the game in the first place. So for me, Brian, as a writer, was like the cavalry coming in to fundamentally connect the movie back to the game in ways that I found interesting.
Okay.
This was after Tracy had done several drafts and had completed her assignment. So then Brian came in and fine-tuned to make it closer to the game. But Brian was one of those guys where we just always spoke to each other, and we talked to each other a lot about what the game was about. It's those wonderful conversations that you want to have with a fellow creative, which is like, all right, what's it about? Yes, but what's it really about?
Of course.
Yes, but what's it really, really about? And then finding the ways of letting Brian know the things that I wanted to do that were my ways into his story. And he said something really beautiful when we were promoting the film. He said, this film, this game was mine, a solo game developer. He created every character, every inch of real estate in that mortuary is something that he thought up in his head and handmade.
Yeah.
Every sound that you hear in that game is something that Brian did. So he always thought of it as something that was his. And then when we collaborated on the film, and indeed he was with us through the hiring process and talking to the production designer about the build of the set. And he was with us literally during principal photography every day. Indeed, he plays the second dead body that you see in the film.
Oh, really?
And, all through post, you saw every iteration of the edit. Brian said, this thing that was mine ultimately became ours. And I really appreciated how inclusive he was of me as a filmmaker, translating his game into a new form, which is, a cinematic narrative.
Yeah.
Brian was enormously supportive of me as a director. He is a cinephile, and he's very passionate about movies. He loves horror films. So, he and I could have really good conversations about not only the form and content, but about what the project meant to us and what we were trying to say with it personally. And, in the doing, we became extremely good friends. It's not something that I anticipated walking into this project, but like Brian has become very close to me. And, he's one of those artists where, we can be talking about the film, but then we could also be hanging out for like 8 hours talking about other things. We would certainly like to collaborate on other projects, whether it's other video game adaptations or original pieces. But regardless, our process was inclusive with each other. And I really appreciated that. He was very protective of me as a filmmaker. And we had many executives, Epic Pictures Group was the producer, and Shudder, our distributor, was involved from the ground up.
Yeah.
But Brian always was there as a protective element for me as a director to make sure that I was able to tell the story that I wanted to tell. And I thought that was very unique and not to be taken for granted.
No, sounds positively heartening from a creative process point of view. You talked about Rebecca Owens' character in the beginning as something that you sort of locked onto as what you could see could make it interesting as a film. So in that sense, then casting the character for the film, what was it about Willa Holland that caught your eye in terms of who Rebecca is? But also, was there a moment in the shooting of the movie where you were like, she took the character to a place where even you didn't think it could go, and it was like, that's the character I was hoping to find?
I will answer that. The brief version is yes and yes. The longer version is our casting director, Allison Estrin, was, we all created lists of names of people that we would like to approach. And Allison proposed Willa Holland.
Yeah.
And I'd known Willa's work because she acted in a film produced by Mike Manning, who produced my previous Shudder release, Slapface. So Mike produced a movie that Willa was the lead in. It was a crime movie. And there was something in Willa's performance in that where I was like, wow, she's not waiting to greet you and hug you. There's an element of reserve in her where it makes the audience have to lean forward and go to her.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, some of my best friends are like that. The people that are not as easy to get to know sometimes can be the ones that you find yourself growing the closest to, or being the most interested in. So we made Willa an offer. And I spoke to her a few times on Zoom and on the phone while we were deciding whether to work with each other.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I really liked about Willa that I intuited, but it was really great hearing her talk about it, was that she started acting in movies and TV shows and commercials when she was 6 years old. She was like the next door neighbor of Steven Spielberg, and her stepdad was Brian De Palma. So she was kind of thrust into show business.
Yeah.
At a very early age. And Spielberg, I think, said something like, she's got the makings of a star. Let's put her in the movies. And De Palma and Spielberg, of course, are luminary filmmakers. But I think that what that cost Willa was her entire childhood.
Yeah.
She spent more time being on movie sets, playing make-believe, than engaging with other friends. She was not in school. She was on set. She was not engaging with other children at playtime. She was acting with adults. And consequently, acting in movies started to feel more real to her than given circumstances of reality. And this led to a lot of difficulties in her life. And she's even gone through periods where she was like, I don't know if I want to be an actor because you're engaged in being in the process of a giant machine that drains you of any contact with other actual, interactions with reality or human beings, making a movie is a very artificial environment, which as I've said, I really love working on movies. I love playing make-believe. I love playing in the sandbox with a cast and a crew.
Yeah.
but at the expense of not having a life, especially as a child and as a teenager. I think it took something out of Willa, and I think that ever since in her adult life, she's very much wanted to engage with what it is to be a human being,
Okay.
And so I thought, yeah, well, Rebecca Owens was also denied her childhood and lives in her work and not in her life. It was a theme that Willa completely understood and was able to connect with. And, Mike Manning, the producer of the crime movie that she'd done, he said, like, I think you guys will bring out the best in each other, she's a very not self-conscious actor, and she will be the kind of actor that will ask you, I'd never had an actor ask me to see the shot list or the mood boards and stuff like that, because her actual dad is a cinematographer and she takes an interest in the process of filmmaking.
Okay.
And so it made her, and she hated to be talked to like an actor, I think, because of the stuff that she'd been through in her life. She didn't like even the most rudimentary kind of direction you would give an actor, which is like 5 words or less with an active verb in it. She was very uncomfortable with those things, but she said, just tell me the piece of the story you want us to tell in this shot, and I will fill it for you.
Okay.
And consequently, like her performance was wonderful. And the moment that I knew that we had it, to return to that part of your question.
Yeah.
Very early on, we shot the Narcotics Anonymous scene where Rebecca is giving a speech to her fellow addicts.
Yeah.
And, it's a very human situation, public speaking, especially for someone as shy as Rebecca Owens, who's more comfortable with the dead than the living, is, a very stressful situation. And Willa felt very strongly about wanting to honor the people from the program that she knew. So she was working very hard on the monologue and refining it, and even incorporating things that were personal to her into the written material. And the producers were getting very nervous. They were like, is she changing the script? It's like, no, she's just, the form of the script is not changing. It's like she's adding things that will make it feel resonant and real to her. So she's in her trailer, working on this thing, and we're texting each other, and I'm on set, and, it's like, where's Willa? What's going, the people are getting really nervous because, now we're like, quote unquote, an hour behind.
Mm-hmm.
But then she shows up and she says, Jeremiah, I'm really nervous and I don't know if I can do this. And I said, that's exactly what Rebecca Owens would say. And she said, you're right. And then she kind of launched into it in that spirit. And it was really magnificent. Her performance
it
was really honest. And then we wrapped, I think we wrapped early that night because, her level of preparation was so strong and so personal that we kind of shot that scene actually quite quickly, it was, and I think it's because of the level of commitment that she brought to the scene and to the sequence.
Yeah.
We even added extra shots that night, which is something that never happens when you're on independent film. You're always behind schedule and you're always cutting shots. And that was a scene where, because we were so on point and because Willa was so prepared, we were able to add a couple of extra shots in the sequence that are in the movie. And that was really quite remarkable. I was so proud of Willa on that day and so proud of all of us for giving her the space to do the work she needed to do.
I can imagine. Now, in your extended cast, Britfix listeners will be familiar with one of the names there, John Adams, who's been on the podcast 4 times now.
Beautiful.
So can you tell me, and obviously one quarter of the Addams family, the sort of horror film machine now, that they are.
Yes, I love their films.
Indeed. No, me too. And so how did John get to be? It's the first time I've seen John outside of his family production. So how did John get involved with the movie?
Okay, so I was fans of the Addams family, and we knew each other because their movie Hellbender and my movie Slapface dropped on Shudder the same month, which was February 2022.
Got you.
So we knew each other that way. I'd seen their film and I absolutely loved it. I thought that the way that film represents teenagers is unlike anything else.
It's amazing,
because I think very much because Zelda and Lulu, who were teenagers at the time, contributed so strongly to the voice of that movie.
Yeah.
All of the Addams family are remarkable actors. John and Toby Poser, his wife, and Zelda and Lulu, their children. So in the script, we had Rebecca's dad. And I remember sitting, I remember sitting by the window and thinking to myself, who would be my dream actor for this part? If I could pick anybody in the world to play this, I was like, well, John Adams, because John has the sensitivity and the humanity of a loving father who is doing his best against really difficult odds. And also he has the rock and roll punk rock persona.
Quite literally.
He can tap into his demonic side. Yeah. So I called up John and I was like, hey, I'm making a film based on the video game Mortuary Assistant. Would you be interested? I'll send you the script. He's like, don't send me the script yet. Tell me about the character. I want to see if it's in my wheelhouse.
Oh, right. Okay.
And so I described what I just told you. And so he's like, yeah, dad who loves his children. That's me. I don't need to act that. And I'm like, and what about the rock and roll demon? He's like, oh, I know who that guy is. He's had his own struggles with addiction and demons over the years. He's talked about in his films and in interviews.
Yeah.
So John understood what we were doing. And he's like, great, send over the script. And when it's go time, I'm going to hop in my truck and I'm going to drive to Missouri where we shot the film. John and I are both based in New York.
Okay.
And when we worked on the movie together, it was really quite a great experience. It's like, it's always wonderful when an actor has also directed before because they know what you're up against. So John was very generous and very open. And he had a similar moment to Willa. There's a scene where he has to speak to Rebecca in a very sincere and personal way towards the end of the movie.
Yeah.
And John, again, like Willa pulled me aside and was like, hey, I normally don't get nervous going in front of the camera, but like, I feel a little vulnerable. And I said, well, why don't we do this, John? Like, why don't we, why not in the first take, you'll play it as if you're talking to Zelda. And then the second take, you'll play it as if you're talking to Lulu. And he's like, well, that'll be two very different performances. It's like one of them is like string and feathers, and the other is made of metal. And I didn't ask which was which. I was like, all the feathers, or. But I said, okay, John, let's do it. Take one was to Zelda, and take two was to Lulu, and they were interesting in their differences. And most of what you see on screen is like him talking to Zelda, but the button on the scene is him talking to Lulu. So him being able to personalize his performance as if he were talking to one of his children gave the role the personal touch that I was looking for, because John is such a sincere person.
Yeah.
There's just honesty exudes off of John Adams, So we had a good time together. He said, I hope we get to do this again sometime. So I would like to work with all of the Adams family at some point, but my time with John was beautiful. And, he's been very supportive. He's been coming out and with us during, he came out for the premiere screening. And then we're doing a special screening in a mortuary in Connecticut next week. And John is coming out for that as well. Fantastic. Because he was like, well, you just can't beat the idea of 100 people watching this movie in a funeral parlor.
No, you want to be there. You want to be there for that during the film. You want to be there. Now,
for sure.
Now, obviously, we've talked a bit. We've talked something about the adapting it from video game to screen. So, in terms of what we see on screen, then when you and your cinematographer Kevin Duggan were discussing the look and feel of the movie, where did your conversations go in terms of what you wanted to achieve in terms of that finished film?
We had a lot of conversations. It was my first time working with Kevin.
Mm-hmm.
And when we first met, it was really great because we were obviously talking about the underpinnings of the movie, but also he really understood technically what I was going for. Like he was a camera operator a couple of times for Dean Cundy, who was the cinematographer of John Carpenter's The Thing and Halloween and Jurassic Park and many great films that we love. So he understood when I was talking about shooting in widescreen on anamorphic lenses. He immediately got what I was going for. And we were both able to use Dean Cundy as a reference and say, like, you know, it's like, well, Dean, in his work with John Carpenter, did such beautiful work with foreground and background. And then that led to like 3 months of pre-production where Kevin and I are talking about how we're going to make the movie. And I'll give a couple of examples. So a couple times in the movie, in the screenplay by Tracy Beebe, she would just write time slips and she would write it diagonally across the screen.
Oh, nice.
And so Kevin and I were like, well, what does that mean, time slips? You know, how do we visually represent that? And Kevin was like, well, you know, instead of doing some green screen or blue screen element, what if we built some specialized rigs that Rebecca could be harnessed to? So when Willa Holland came to set, literally she sees these contraptions that look like amusement park rides where she has to be strapped in.
Oh, wow.
So there's a sequence where she has a migraine and she sits down, and then it's as if she's pulled through the room in an L shape, like she's pulled backwards and then to the side. And that was not a green screen element. That was her attached to a rig.
Really?
It was pushing her through a room. And then there's another bit where
that's super effective, by the way. That's super effective, by the way.
Ah, good. I'm glad to hear. These, you know, it's, you really feel great when you're working with grips and electrics who are sitting in a warehouse space, like nailing together and building together little pieces of metal, and then like strapping themselves in and riding around on them.
Yeah.
There was another one where she falls backwards, and so she's in the mortuary and then falls backwards and lands in a completely different location. And that also was done entirely practically, where half the set looked like the mortuary and like a part of the set looked like this other location that she winds up in. You know, and that was also Willa attached to a rig that would like drop her through the air. So she's literally falling through air, safely on this rig. You know, those were the kinds of things that like Kevin was so wonderful at dreaming up, because we both knew that this movie took place in a phantasmagoric space. But, and, you know, even though the budget was bigger than Slapface, my previous Shudder film, you know, it still was relatively small. So like, we knew that like, if we built it, it would be cheaper. You know, if we actually made something, it would be more, it would kind of pull the viewer into the reality, and it wouldn't have that airy-fairy feeling of CGI. One last thing I'll say about Kevin and some of the choices that we made were during the embalming, there are all these very tight close-ups of tubes being inserted into dead bodies' necks and incisions being made on them.
Yes, indeed.
So these were made with a very specific medical lens called the probe lens, which is a very, very narrow lens that requires a lot more light. But it allows you to get very, very close to the wound, and it renders the wound into a landscape. We, of course, notified our special effects artist, Norman Cabrera, who's been doing it for like 50 years. You know, he's a very experienced FX artist. But, you know, it was very helpful for him to know that the lens was going to get that close to his special effects. And he was like, all right, send me photographs of every dead body that you cast so that I can specifically match their pigment and their skin tone and their body type. Because if you're getting that close, then you're going to see everything. You're going to see
God, I never saw that.
You're going to see the flesh under the skin, and everything is going to need to be a level of accuracy that, you know, you could hide if you were not using such an unforgiving lens. So these were the kinds of things that Kevin and I spoke about and included. You know, it was a very inclusive process where, like, when building the set, Kevin and I would go through our entire shot list with our brilliant production designer, Chelsea Turner, so the set could be built specific for the camera moves that we wanted to do. You know, like, we would go through the shot list with our special effects artist, so he knew exactly what we were going to see. Because again, with a limited budget, you have to make choices in advance and put the money towards the things that will show up on screen. So Kevin was really innovative and inventive.
It sounds it.
The entire process, and fun. You know, we laughed a lot, you know, during this very morbid process, you know, and in doing so, he was a real brother to me during principal photography.
Fantastic. Well, look, that brings us to the close of part one of the podcast. Thank you for sharing that insight into the making of Mortuary Assistant. Mortuary Assistant will be available on Shudder from the 27th of March, 2026. Part 2 of the podcast, as regular listeners will know, is 3 films that have impacted everything in your adult life. Jeremiah has given me 3 titles, which I'll do in the order that he gave them me. I should add, he did say to me in the conversations we had on text that he could easily have picked 3 different ones, RoboCop, Threads, and Paris, Texas, with the examples, because what I was asking was impossible for a cinephile. But I did reassure him that the format does allow for repeat attendance, so you can have 3 other films that are important and have impact on your life. So what we're looking at is 3 films that are important, not the only 3 films, I suppose, is the important thing. Does that sound right?
Yes, that's perfect.
Indeed. Right. We are going to get 5 minutes per film, and every time we hear this sound, you can hear that at your end, okay?
Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay. Starter for 10. We are going to start with 1978's Killer of Sheep, a new film to me, written and directed by Charles Burnett, a filmmaker who is Mississippi born, but raised in Watts, Los Angeles, where Killer of Sheep is set. It's about a slaughterhouse worker who must suspend his emotions to continue working at a job he finds repugnant, but then finds he has little sensitivity left for the family he works so hard to support. Fun fact, the Library of Congress declared Killer of Sheep a national treasure and one of the first 50 to get on the National Film Registry, which is 100 films, must-see films. However, this was a surprise. However, since the film was made without proper permits, rights acquisitions due to the music rights, the film was never shown theatrically when it was or made available on video. It'd only been seen on 16mm prints at museums and film festivals. But in 2018, 30 years after the premiere, a new 35mm print of Killer Sheep was brilliantly restored by UCLA Film and Television Archive, which I think is to the benefit of cinema, and I'll be hunting it out after this podcast. But tell me, why is Killer of Sheep such an important film and had so much impact on you?
Killer of Sheep is it's one of those movies where it's done in a cinema verite style, but it's not a narrative movie. It's like a series of incidents that happen to Stan, the killer of sheep of the title, who works 8 hours a day in the slaughterhouse, but also like the community around him. Stan is our main character, but there are so many scenes in the film that are from the point of view of children. There are always children running around in Watts. Yeah. And some of the stuff seems weird at first. Like one of the kids like always is wearing a rubber mask that's like in the shape of a dog. And initially you might think that that's like a bit of David Lynch weirdness. But then like once you realize that real life is so strange and so peculiar in its own, that when you portray reality on screen in such a way, it becomes kind of magical. That was something that really spoke to me, seeing Killer of Sheep, which I saw a print of in a revival house when I was quite young. Okay. And I grew up in not in the urban landscape of Watts, but I grew up in a very poor, like well underclass rural environment in Rhode Island. And, seeing the kids in poverty finding ways to spend their time and entertain themselves, really spoke to me. I was like, oh, is this not like something highly relatable to me, where you're so bored all the time and you have no money and you have nothing to do that you kind of invent your own play. So when the kids are like having a snowball fight with rocks, or like jumping from one rooftop to another across the vast chasm underneath, it's very scary, but it's also kind of exhilarating, the way that the kids are using their imagination to spend their time. And indeed, Stan, the protagonist, he has a scene where he's sitting at the kitchen table with his friend Bracy, and he's holding a cup of tea up against his cheek. And he's saying, like, doesn't this remind you of, that warm feeling you get from the tea against your cheek? Doesn't it remind you of like when you're hot after making love with your wife and the way that her brow feels? And Bracy just responds, he's the comic relief character. He's like, it sounds like you're turned on by malaria. But these things are endlessly delightful. I was like, even Stan, who is like trying to show so much resilience and not making enough money and, you know, trying to hold his family together and just kind of take it one day at a time. You know, like even he is able to find the absurd and the poetic in given circumstances. The movie is also staggeringly beautiful. There's a shot of Stan and his wife dancing in a two-shot that holds for like 3 minutes while they're listening to a record. And they're so exhausted and they're so worn out. And they're dancing in a slow circle. And it's both really sad because you just feel the lack of energy between them. And then it's really magical because the music is so beautiful and it's so intimate and it's so sincere. And Killer of Sheep made me realize you don't even necessarily need a plot for movies. You just need a series of very interesting incidents. And the audience, in the case of myself, like you piece together these incidents like pearls on a string that form a necklace. And watching Killer of Sheep, I was like, oh, this really represents poverty in America in a way that most movies don't dare to show. When the reviews came out for my movie Slapface, they often
finish your thought.
When the reviews came out for my movie Slapface, they often compared it to Deborah Granick's Winter's Bone, which also takes place on the outskirts of America.
Right.
And, you know, while I love Deborah Granick's Winter's Bone, Killer of Sheep was definitely a bigger inspiration on the way to incorporate personal life elements into your movie. Because indeed, most of the scenes in Killer of Sheep were things that Charles Burnett things that had happened to him or things that he'd heard about. So that's what Killer of Sheep means to me.
Amazing. Well, thank you for introducing me and the audience to this film. It's one I'll be certainly hunting out. For your second choice, we'll be staying in 1978, but for a very different type of movie, George Romero's Dawn of the Dead, the dystopian zombie film. I say dystopian, but obviously it was a contemporary film with a zombie attack in it, wasn't it? Set in the shopping mall where two SWAT team members, a traffic reporter and a TV exec girlfriend have sought refuge after escaping the city. Fun fact, and this was something I hadn't realised, this was the most profitable of the Dead series. Probably helped in no end by extras who appeared in the film were reportedly paid $1 in cash, a donut, and a Dawn of the Dead t-shirt. It is said that the head explosion moment was a game changer in terms of gore we saw on screen. Mr. Tom Savini's gore should add. Horror films before Dawn of the Dead didn't show that kind of graphic detail, in-your-face violence. And Savini agrees and said, audiences said, oh no, if this is the beginning of the movie, what are they going to do towards the end of the movie? So why does this film hold so much memories for you, and what impact does it have on you?
I saw Dawn of the Dead as a little kid. And like I said, you know, there was enormous poverty and a lot of boredom in my growing up time. And you constantly try to fill it with imaginative stuff, playing in the woods and so on. Dawn of the Dead was like a fantasy to me, because we would always go to the mall on the weekends and walk around. And in Dawn of the Dead, when the apocalypse happens, they're like, all right, they land their helicopter and are living inside of an indoor mall. And I was like, that's perfect. That's where I want to live. Yeah. Because you have access to everything. All the food is there. You can sleep in the beds. You have clothes. You have everything that you need. You know, it just felt like a paradise and a playground. You know, but the movie does something really interesting that was not lost on me even when I was a little kid, which is they kill all the zombies in the mall. They seal everything off and they're safe and they're living in the mall. And after a while, there's a long stretch of the movie where they have everything and then they're getting so bored by it, you know? And I found that endlessly fascinating because as a kid, I was like, I just want more than what I have. I desperately want better clothes. I desperately want better food. I don't want to worry about turning the thermostat up because we don't have any money to do that. And in Dawn of the Dead, it's like you have everything. You know, what's there to be bored about? And then, you know, it's just such an aspect of human nature where like first you want it all and then you just have everything, you know? And Dawn of the Dead is like truly frightening in that way. Like once the zombie apocalypse stuff is taken care of, it's like being stuck with yourself in given circumstances is undeniably chilling. And then, of course, in the third act, the bikers show up and wreck everything because it's like, that is the history of humankind, is like men come in and fucking demolish everything out of a self-destructive desire to fuck things up.
Yeah.
That was my first time ever seeing Tom Savini in a movie. I loved his special effects. And indeed, I got to work with Tom on my first feature, The Sadist. It was a Killer in the Woods movie. It was a work-for-hire assignment. But I remember saying to the producers, could we hire Tom Savini to be our Killer in the Woods?
Right.
And it's really quite something to work with one of your childhood heroes. And Tom indeed was a delight. And he showed us a few special effects magic tricks that we employed on our film.
Oh, wow.
He was able to do things like show us how to strangle somebody, but then the person being strangled is completely controlling the act. So like when you watch Dawn of the Dead, it's like watching a series of magnificent magic tricks where you imagine during the script development, they were thinking of all sorts of interesting ways to kill people. But Tom Savini indeed is a magician. And George Romero also inspirational in that, it feels like community filmmaking, when you see the police or the National Guard or the military in the movie, you feel like George Romero called up the Pittsburgh, police department, or he called the Pennsylvania National Guard and was like, hey, I'm an independent filmmaker. I'm making a movie. Can I film you guys on your weekend adventures? And that taught me a lot, because I was like, some stuff that feels inaccessible when you have no money, you can make some phone calls and you can get some of the things that you need. So I applied the George Romero technique on my feature Slapface, where, we asked the local police department, can we film in the police station? We've got Dan Hedaya from Blood Simple being the sheriff. It's like, if we can get our picture taken with him, the dad from Clueless, we'll give you access to our police station. We'll give you our jackets. And indeed, the cops showed up and took our craft service and donuts, even on days that they were not working. So thank you, Fishkill Police Department. But it was really because of George Romero inspiring me to believe that we are all part of a community. And if you want something, pick up the phone and call your local police department or your local services. Dawn of the Dead is filled with that. But indeed, the entire ball is that.
I think it was on the commentary for Land of the Dead, or it was an interview around Land of the Dead, which was Romero's only studio picture. And he lamented the fact that previously he had so much creative control, and then he lost it all. Even though he had more money than he'd ever had before, he'd lost the creative control of making the movie. So he said you might be moving between sets or locations. And on the way, if you're making the movie yourself and you see something better than where you're going, you can just stop and do it there. There's no. But whereas when he said, I'm paraphrasing now, so if I can't claim all accuracy here, but basically he was saying you would sign off on the shots with the executives in the morning, and they would expect what you've signed off on to be what they receive. The idea that if you did something different or deviated was not to be encouraged, and therefore he felt really hindered by that part of the process.
Yeah, my filmmaker friend Lucas Hassel compares it to being on an ocean liner versus being on a speedboat. So independent films are like a speedboat. It's like, oh, that looks interesting over there. Let's just pull the boat over and we'll film there. And, the bigger the production, you're on an ocean liner. It's like, hey, can we film over there? It's like, no, we've got 300 people on this boat and we're moving. If to get the ocean liner over there, we'll lose an entire day. Forget it, But yeah, like Romero back in his Pittsburgh filmmaking days, was inspirational because he just knew the people who owned the mall and said, wouldn't that be interesting if we had zombies in a mall? And he just called them up and they said, sure, come after we close. You can't imagine anybody allowing that kind of access nowadays,
Yeah, because it was basically out of hours, wasn't it? It was out of hours. Right. They used the mall. Amazing. Well, look, let us fast forward to your final choice and into the new millennium for 2009's Megan Fox, Amanda Seyfried star Jennifer's Body, directed by Karen Kusuma and written by Diablo Cody. This dark horror comedy is about a newly possessed high school cheerleader, Megan Fox, who turns into a succubus that specializes in killing her male classmates. Despite mixed critical reception, the film has gained a strong cult following over the years, even garnering, which I didn't know this, an unofficial musical in 2018. And a not-so-fun fact, in February 2006 interview for the New York Times, while trying to illustrate how completely the studio's all-male marketing department misunderstood the point of the movie, Karen recalled that one of them, the ideas was for Megan Fox to do live chats with amateur porn sites. But tell me, why is this film holds such memories for you, and why, and what impact did it have on you?
Well, I think the first thing about Jennifer's Body is that when the movie came out, I didn't see it because critically it was despised. And then audiences turned on the movie as well. It seemed like a movie that nobody liked. And it wasn't until many years later, when it was developing a cult following, that I saw it on streaming. But, cult movies, it's like a movie that on the surface seems to be one thing and then is genuinely about something else has always been close to my heart.
Yeah.
Movies like They Live and RoboCop and Dirty Dancing seem to be one thing on the surface. But then the deeper you dig into what the movie's really about, you discover there's so much more than that. So Jennifer's Body initially seems to be about, hot Megan Fox is a succubus that all the dudes want to fuck, and everybody wants to be her. She's the top cheerleader. She's the beauty queen. She's everything, and then as it happens when she lures men in, she devours them because she's a demon who eats men, so that's what it seems to be about. But as you watch the movie, you realize that it's about the way that a hierarchy is built around women inherent in the title. Jennifer's Body is objectified by dudes in this film. But Jennifer's Body is also used by dudes. Like the antagonist of the film, and this is not a major spoiler, it is indeed something that is probably useful to know for anybody who doesn't want to see Jennifer's Body, is that there's a shitty indie rock and roll band that like kidnaps Jennifer and does a demonic ritual on her so that they can get rich and famous. And I was like, oh my God, it's brilliant, because like men will throw women under the bus at the first opportunity to achieve their goals, and they want women to not be people. They want them to be trophies. They want, so Jennifer's Body in the script by Diablo Cody really neatly subverts this by having the most powerful girl in the school, Megan Fox, Jennifer, be the one that every woman wants to be and every dude wants to screw. And she completely turns it around on them by devouring them. But also it makes her a tragic figure because she didn't ask to be that. She didn't ask to be an object, nor did she ask to be a demon. These were things that were inflicted on her, and she does these things in order to survive. Now, if she's our Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde character, then our Mr. Utterson is Needy, played by Amanda Seyfried, who is our protagonist and, would be deemed undesirable by anybody who's standing her next to Megan Fox. Amanda Seyfried is obviously gorgeous, and that's a strange thing in movies where we can't really, whatever. I mean, that, we don't have time to get into all that.
Yeah.
But Amanda Seyfried also wants to be Jennifer because she feels like an outsider and unloved, and she wants to be objectified. Like she wants to be high on the food chain. And she thinks that by proximity to Jennifer, even if Jennifer is a demon, like she will have access to that. And then it turns into this rather strange love story between them with a rather notorious, bisexual and lesbian relationship between them that gets very complicated.
Finish your thought.
The complications pile up and ensue. So Jennifer's Body ultimately is a cult classic that was despised because it was mismarketed. And if you join the cult, as it were, which so many cult movies are, where you hear about it and say like, oh, you should check out Repo Man because it presents a subculture that you might not be aware of. Jennifer's Body indeed has more ideas on the go and within a very entertaining horror movie package than most movies do. It's also like criminally underseen, which is why I wanted to include it in the three movies that have inspired me. Brilliant.
Well, I applaud you for drawing attention to it. I would. One of my films that I feel very similar about is Pascal Lauguet's Tall Man, which stars Jessica Biel, and was marketed as some sort of weird slasher film when in fact it's a brilliant film about wealth inequality.
That's right.
It's a really super clever film about it. Yeah, it was marketed completely weirdly, and I don't know whether it was just to do with whichever way the wind was blowing in terms of how the media felt about Jessica Biel at the time, meant that it never got the love that I thought it deserved. But I'm hoping that will get its cult status in due course.
Yeah, unfortunately, both of these films were victims of extreme misogyny, and both of them are really smart and really good and well worth digging up. Indeed.
Well, look, that brings us to the end of 3 films that have impacted everything in your adult life. Thank you for sharing those stories from your own personal film watching biography. And thank you for giving us that insight into The Mortuary Assistant, which is out on Shudder from 27th of March 2026. And it just gives me to say thank you very much for giving your time on the podcast.
Stuart, it was a real pleasure talking to you.
Do remember to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, follow on Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts for more movies that impacted your life. And if you want to, I'd love to know what your favourite movies are, what your fondest movie memories are. So please share your favourite movies that impacted your life on Twitter. Look for @LeightonRocks. And you can always leave me a review, 5-star preferably. And in your review, tell us which 3 films impacted your life. Best ones get read out on the podcast.
Hey there, it's Hugh from Moderation here. If you like today's show, why not have a listen to The Ramble? Ridiculous, irreverent, and sometimes maybe just a little bit raunchy. The Ramble is what you get when you put 2 professionally funny people in a room together and give them license to talk about anything they want underneath the umbrella of nerdy hobbies. We think you'll love it, and if you want to check it out, go to our website at poderation.com.